Last week, we looked at a process for design thinking that Tim Brown worked on at IDEO and wrote about in the article you read in the Harvard Business Review. This week, I'm having you read a piece by Dubberly, Evanson, and Robinson about a somewhat different approach to the design thinking process. It's still the same process, but the conceptual model of it is different in this article. Whereas Brown's model of the process is pretty, what I might call open, this model, called the analysis synthesis bridge model, is a lot more structured. I want to look at it because I think this version of the process, this particular model, really emphasizes the role of research in a more concrete way and emphasizes the importance of being a good researcher, which is something you'll work on in the digital media minor. So let's take a look at the model. The interesting thing about this model is there's actually a few different things going on. So I'm going to break this model down piece by piece to kind of explain the different sections. So one way to look at it is to look at it as a series of 4 steps. We might call these quadrants in this model because it's in the shape of a square, but each quadrant is really like a step. So step number 1 starts in the lower left-hand corner, and this is figuring out concretely what the existing or current happening is. You know, if we're solving a problem, what's going on? If the problem is that it's difficult to teach online, what is the current state of teaching online? What kinds of things are classes typically featuring? How many students are involved? What are the classes like? Then in the second step, we create an abstract model of what we found in the first step. So step 1 is sort of concrete, this is data, and then we turn it into information and we create a model of what that data is showing us. And then in step 3, we create a model of what could be. So we say, okay, here's how it is, but here's what we think would be better. And then in step 4, we actually implement our model of what could be. So we're going from looking at and observing and understanding through research what's going on right now to understanding that in a more abstract way, like telling stories about it. And then we come up with an idea of what could exist instead that would be better, and then we make that happen. And I've drawn a little arrow in the center in the shape of a circle because the important thing here is that the process repeats. Once we get to step 4 and we implement our vision, we're not done. We then have to go back to step 1, which is concrete research on what is. So step 4 says, hey, we implement it. And then that means our implementation is now the existing or current state of things. So we start over with step 1, researching kind of the solution that we made. Did it work? How did it work? And we start over. And you can go around this circle. You can go through steps 1 through 4 twice, 3 times, 4 times, 100 times. You just go around as many times as you need to until the problem is solved in, to the best of your abilities. And you might find that the problem seems solved, but 5 years later things change and the existing state is a little bit different. You have to go through the process again. So that's one way of looking at this model. I mean, that's one way of kind of focusing at the particulars of this model. Another thing to keep in mind about this model, another way of kind of looking at it and breaking it down, is to think about the first 2 steps as belonging to research or analysis, and the second 2 steps consisting of making or synthesis. And this model is actually called the analysis synthesis bridge model, and it's because of this way of looking at it right here. The left side, we analyze what's going on. On the right side, we synthesize a new way of doing things. And the bridge means that we move from the left to the right, and that's part of the activity that we undertake as designers. Another way of looking at this is to think about the top as abstract. So steps 2 and 3 are really abstract and based on models and interpretation, and this is where storytelling happens, when we're telling stories about the existing state of things or what we think would be better. And the bottom is concrete. So we're kind of moving in and out from concrete to abstract. So concrete, we gather concrete evidence, observations, data, interviews. abstract, we tell stories about what that all means. And then we create a new model of what might solve the problem, but then we have to make that concrete by implementing it and making it real. So you can see that the process starts by trying to understand the current state of things where the problem is in the lower left-hand corner. You do that by collecting data in different ways, and then you analyze that data into a story of what's happening in the second quadrant. Then you tell a new story of what you want to happen in the top right quadrant. Then you implement it in the bottom right quadrant. So you've gone around the model, and then of course you can start over. So similar to Brown's model, but more specific. And once you implement, you immediately start over and collect data on what you made, because that's the new state of things. It's design thinking, but a model of the process that's just a little bit different that I found really helpful over the years. The other piece you are reading this week is an overview of different ways of collecting data, which is the first step of the process, and of course the fifth step and the ninth step, since you're doing the process over and over again, in what we call an iterative process. So iterative means over, redone. So we have reiterate, you probably recognize as, emphasizing something again. So an iterative process is when you go through the process multiple times. So when you get to step 4 and then you start over with step 1 immediately, that's an iterative process that you do over and over again until you discover whether your solution is working or not. Or sometimes you just run out of time and money. Sometimes the client is ready to be done, so you have a good enough solution, you go with it. But the optimal, of course, is to go around through the process iteratively as many times as you need to until you have the best possible outcome. You can see in that reading about the different types of research that we can use research to understand attitudes, which is how people feel about something, whether that's a web design, a physical product, a set of rules, a problem, behavior, or whatever it is, and behaviors, which is what people actually do, how they really behave, the things, actions they take. So attitudes, how people feel about something; behaviors, how they actually act. So these are not the same. This is really important. These are not the same thing, but they're both important. Sometimes people feel one way but behave another. People don't always do what they say they do. It's important to, and sometimes it's because they are trying to look better. Sometimes it's because they don't realize there's a difference between what they think and what they do. It's important to know not just what users say a problem is, but what the problem actually is. I've seen all kinds of examples of attitudes and behaviors not matching. So it's important to research both of those things in that first step of the analysis synthesis bridge model, or even in the first step of Brown's design thinking 3-step model. For example, I conducted a usability study on an iPhone once, and one participant didn't know how to use the browser on the iPhone, which is Safari. Where the search bar was, she kept trying to type in the URL like it was the address bar. She didn't know the difference between an address bar and a search bar. And so every time she tried to put a URL in the search bar, of course, it didn't work. So what happened as I watched her behavior is that she really couldn't even use the internet on the phone at all. She couldn't get it to work. Simply couldn't get it to work. But in a post-test survey, she rated the experience really highly. And in the post-test interview, she raved about how great the phone was and how she wished she had one. And as soon as she could afford it, she was going to run out and buy one. So don't always trust people's attitudes and what they say they like or say they think they do, because that's not always true. She could barely use the phone, but she thought that it had been great fun and easy and she wanted one. So actually see what people do. Observe their real behaviors. At the same time, if the behavior users engage in with what you've made is perplexing, but the attitudes are good, maybe the behavior isn't really an issue. So let's say my tester really did run out and buy an iPhone, but she couldn't really use the internet on it. Maybe things could have ended okay for her. Maybe she didn't want to use the internet on it. So you have to be able to understand the difference between attitudes and behaviors and balance those two user attributes. And when you test your designs in the iterative stage, where you create different solutions and test them out, you have to be able to tell the difference between attitudes toward the solution and behaviors toward the solution. You might ask someone if they liked the tool you made, and they might say yes. But if you watch their behaviors, you might see that they didn't really use it the way it was supposed to be used, which indicates a problem. So you have to be able to balance the two user attributes, attitudes and behaviors, and you need to understand that they're not the same.